The trade team of the incoming U.S. administration that will take on the task of directing America's business dealings with its global partners has taken more shape, with the posts of Treasury, Commerce, as well as Trade Representative nominated. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Thursday, November 28th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now today we revisit the implications of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's America First trade policy on the global economy, including that here in South Korea. For more on this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun, a correspondent for EFE Spain. Andres, it's great to have you back.
Hi, Sunhee. Thank you so much for having us here.
I also have Professor Yang Jun-sok at the Catholic University of Korea live on the line. Professor Yang, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
Right. We'll start here in the studio. Andres, let's begin with the response from the media to the nomination of Scott Bessent as the U.S. Treasury Secretary.
Exactly. President-elect Trump tapped Mr. Bessent, a hedge fund manager, as his new Treasury secretary, and basically the coverage that Asian media did of this news, of course, was the fact that Mr. Bessent is going to, together with the Department of Commerce, is basically going to be in charge of implementing everything involving tariffs and trade policy. And of course, given that Mr. Bessent seems to be a fan of Mr. Trump's policy in terms of, for example, tariffs, tax cuts, etc., that of course doesn't bode very well for Asian countries that depend highly on exports, like Korea, for instance, of course, or China, or Japan. Now, Mr. Bessent, for example, has spoken particularly of China. He's been saying that China has been taking advantage of the U.S. Because of unfair practices, and that he wants to have a reciprocal trade, which, means evening out trade balances for the U.S. with other countries, or tipping the balance to have U.S. surpluses, or even weaponizing trade. But we'll leave that going forward. We'll talk about that later. But yes, China probably is going to have the harder part if Mr. Bessent goes forward with all these policies that he's talking about. Some media was speculating about maybe forcing China into signing some sort of phase one deal, that trade deal that China had to sign with the first Trump administration, that fixed a minimum volume of U.S. goods that China had to purchase every year in order to even out that trade balance. Some media were speculating even that Mr. Bessent might try to force China to, let its currency fluctuate in a wider bracket. As we know, China uses the so-called currency peg, which pairs the yuan with a basket of currencies and lets it move on a very small range of 2%. So that keeps the yuan nice and cheap and competitive. And then when it comes to Korea, the perspectives are not very good. Mr. Bessent is also supporting cutting down on subsidies for companies that are manufacturing in the U.S., things like batteries, like electric vehicles, like semiconductors. So this is companies like Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, LG Energy Solution, top Korean manufacturers that actually invested in the U.S. With all these subsidies in mind. And of course, we're doing this to position themselves regarding the possibility that Donald Trump would actually return to the White House, which has been the case. So all in all, of course, concerning reports regarding the tapping of Mr. Bessent as Treasury Secretary.
Right. Professor Yang, what are your thoughts regarding the scope and perhaps speed of Trump's tariffs and their impact on the global trade?
Okay, well, we knew that Trump will institute tariffs, but the numbers keep on changing every time he makes a speech. Now, the numbers that usually came up was 10% general tariffs, 60% tariffs on China, and perhaps 100% tariffs on automobile imports. But those numbers continually change a little bit depending on the speech. But now he's talking about 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, 10% tariffs on China, which he didn't really talk about during his campaign, and he just announced it fairly suddenly. And he justifies these tariffs on the basis that he wants to prevent the imports of illegal drugs like fentanyl and illegal immigrants that's coming from Mexico and China. Mexico and Canada. And China is a source for raw material for some of these illegal drugs. So that's his justification. But the problem is, well, Canada wasn't really known as a major source for illegal immigrants to the United States. It wasn't really known for source for illegal drugs coming into the United States. But Canada, China, and Mexico are three largest U.S. trading partners. So it seems that perhaps he's using the illegal drugs and illegal immigrants just as a sort of an excuse to introduce these tariffs. And also, the very worrying development is that Canada and Mexico belong to USMCA, the FTA with the United States. That used to be NAFTA, but Trump himself renegotiated the NAFTA into USMCA during his first term, but now he seems to be nullifying a lot of provisions of that USMCA. So this seems to indicate that he's going to go after U.S. largest trading partners. He's going to use any excuse, and he's not going to pay particular lot of attention to the international agreements that U.S. has already signed. So this is a very worrying trend, but some of Trump's supporters are saying that this is just a negotiating ploy. Canada and Mexico, once Trump gets into power, they will negotiate, they will give some leeway on the illegal immigrant issue, the illegal drug issue, and then renegotiate some of the tariff rates. Everything will be fine. Well, we'll have to wait and see, but I have my doubts.
Right. I actually did read, Professor Yang, that some pundits are saying, as you just said, that Trump's hardline stance or tough rhetoric is an attempt to seek leverage before negotiations with his trading partners. And before we delve further into that, Andres, most Asian currencies, they strengthened upon news of Trump's Treasury nomination. Could you explain that response for us?
Well, to be honest, I think this was more of a case of the dollar strengthening, actually, rather than Asian currencies. Sorry, the dollar weakening rather than Asian currencies strengthening. What happened, I believe, was that when Mr. Scott Bessent got tapped, well, he's worked with the George Soros investment fund. He went solo, I believe, in 2015 to manage his own hedge fund. And even though he seems to be a true believer in lots of Donald Trump's policies, he is a Wall Street figure. He's not an outsider. So markets initially received his tapping positively. And what happened was Mr. Bessent, on top of supporting tax cuts, is also a great supporter of reducing U.S. deficit. So, of course, this did affect the yields of U.S. Treasury bonds, which made them more attractive. So investors basically took their money from a safe asset that is the US dollar and put some of it into 10-year Treasury bonds that weaken the dollar. And this is basically what we've been seeing. In the particular case of the won has taken a hard blow, especially after Trump's victory, of course, on the perspective that his future trade policies might affect the Korean economy badly. So the trend seems to be the won is once again weakening slightly against the US dollar, but it's still on a lower level, at least within the past week.
Right. Professor Yang, as Andres mentioned, a strong dollar, it does no favors for Korea and neither for Mr. Trump, who is seeking to ease the trade deficit with trading partners across the world. Simply speaking then, what do you believe are the repercussions of a strong dollar for economies here in this part of the world, including South Korea?
Okay, well, during his campaign, Trump has stated that the two pillars of his economic plan is tariffs and low interest rates. But I think we can also add a third pillar, which is low taxes, especially low corporate taxes. Now, the tariffs, unless you change macroeconomic variables in the United States, like savings and investment, imposing tariffs usually lead to a stronger dollar, not a weaker dollar. And then the corporate tax cuts and tax cuts in general, they're expected to increase the government deficit, despite what the new Secretary of Commerce to be has mentioned. And that will probably be inflationary, and that will probably lead to higher interest rates. So either way, even though Trump has stated that weak dollar is one of his pillars, it's going to be very difficult to get weaker dollars. So we're probably going to be have a strong U.S. dollar as a general trend during his term. And well, for Korea, having strong dollar does not, I think, necessarily will impact trade that much. In the last decade or so, the exchange rate hasn't really affected Korean trade very much, partially because Korean trade has moved on to higher value-added, higher technology goods like smartphones that isn't necessarily affected too much by exchange rates. Also, semiconductors, it really depends more on demand for semiconductors than the changes in price that comes from changes in exchange rates. So I don't think strong dollar will affect us that much, at least in terms of exports. It may affect us in terms of inflation. The stronger dollar will make goods, imported goods, more expensive coming into Korea. So we probably will have to be you will face more problems with inflation, I think, especially at the end of the first year or from the second year of Trump's term.
Right. Meanwhile, Andres, moving forward then, where do talks between China and the EU on avoiding EV tariffs stand?
Well, despite Bernd Lange, who's the European Parliament's chairman of the Trade Committee, he spoke some days ago saying that a deal was drawing closer. Then some officials actually spoke up and said, well, actually, we're not that close to a deal. There's still many thorny issues. One of the probably the solution that the EU wants to come up with or include in the deal is basically fixing a minimum level price for Chinese e-vehicles, electric vehicles in the European market. Why? Because the EU back in September, October determined that the prices of electric vehicles, Chinese electric vehicles sold in Europe was so low because of heavy Chinese government subsidizing. So what it did was basically it imposed up to 45% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Beijing, of course, did not like this decision and actually is taking it to the World Trade Organization. So what's happening now is that they're trying to sign off this deal, make try to make everybody as happy as possible. Especially, there's some European Union members like Hungary that has a lot of Chinese investments regarding electric vehicles in its territory, or Germany that are not happy with, of course, that heavy tariff that was levied on Chinese electric vehicles. Germany, why? Because as one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, it obviously is fearing that China will backlash with a heavy tariff on German gasoline cars. And that, of course, at this time would fare really bad on German manufacturers. They're going through a rough patch right now with increasing costs and bad situations, for example, like with companies like Volkswagen that is, announcing that it's going to slash lots of employment and so on.
Right. Andres, earlier on, Professor Yang mentioned the USMCA and negotiations for this trilateral trade deal among the US, Mexico and Canada are slated to take place. Now, against that backdrop, Mexico has reportedly launched a campaign to replace Chinese parts with locally made parts.
Yes, exactly. Newly elected President Claudia Sheinbaum announced the other day that the government had been communicating with Mexican-based companies in order to have the Chinese components that they're using for many of their finished goods to try to source them, to actually replace them with Mexican manufactured pieces, either by Mexican companies or North American Mexican-based companies. Why is this? Because both Canada and the US have expressed concern that Mexico, because of the USMCA, was actually sourcing all these Chinese parts into the North American markets, into Canadian and the US market. So hopefully this could appease both Ottawa's and Washington's concerns, but we'll see, because as Professor Yang was mentioning, some days later, President Trump mentioned that on day one of his term, he wants to levy 25% taxes on Canada and Mexico in order to fight illegal drug trafficking and immigration. We'll see how this pans out. President Sheinbaum actually wrote a letter to Mr. Trump that was quite bold, and I think it was the right thing to do. She defended the fact that Mexico has been investing a lot on border control, that arrests in U.S. borders are on a 4-year low, and also pointed out that it's a two-way road. She said that, for example, 70% of all weapons apprehended in Mexico are either sold or manufactured in the U.S. So we'll see how everything works out once Mr. Trump is named officially the President of the United States.
Right, which will take place on the 20th of January next year. Professor Yang, back here in South Korea, policymakers at the central bank lowered their key interest rate by a 0.25 percentage point to 3%. Now, this is the second cut following the first one last month. What have been the ripple effects of the first cut?
Well, there hasn't been all that much, because a lot of the rate cut has been preordained, and it's sunk into the market well before the actual time of the rate cut. But there has been some concerns that some of that funds freed up from the first rate cut went into the housing market, and it contributed to rise in housing prices, and perhaps even starting a price bubble in the Seoul housing market, as well as increasing household debt, which is already at a very high and perhaps dangerous level. So a lot of people were not expecting an additional rate cut today, but Bank of Korea somewhat surprised a lot of people by lowering the rates again. This is the first time in more than a decade that there has been 2 consecutive rate cuts. And I think the major factor here is not only the lackluster domestic economy, and a lot of small and micro businesses are in trouble, but also along with the current announcement the Bank of Korea readjusted its forecast for economic growth. They lowered economic growth for this year from 2.4 to 2.2%, which is in line with some of the other recent estimates, like from the IMF. But the next year and the year after, the readjustment was somewhat surprising because the next year's growth was readjusted below 2% to 1.9, and for 2026 it was readjusted to 1.8. And I think the growth rate having been below 2% has somewhat alarmed the Bank of Korea, which is one of the reasons for this rate cut. And at least in the short term, it seems to have awakened the stock market. The stock prices went up today, and perhaps because consequences of that, the won strengthened slightly today. But in the long term, because the interest rate difference between U.S. and Korea were made greater by this rate cut, this is one more slight force to weaken the Korean won rather than strengthen it.
Right, Professor Yang, speaking about the U.S., what are your prospects regarding the policy direction of the Federal Reserve next month, that is December?
Okay, well, they have been giving signals that they will lower the rates again by 25 basis points, a baby step in December. And I think at least for now, that will still take place. But inflation has not gone exactly the way that the Fed has wanted. The PCE inflation, the one that the Fed uses as a benchmark, it rose slightly in October, and it hasn't gone down as far as perhaps the Fed would like. This is basically due to the shelter prices that has been going down as much as the Fed wanted. So there is some speculation that while they will probably lower the rates once more for December, their rate cuts for next year may be slower than expected. And in addition, if President Trump's policies go through mostly as he's announced during his campaign, most of those policies will be inflationary, which means that perhaps the Fed will very much slow down the rate of the rate cuts, or maybe they'll even stop the rate cuts if President Trump's new policies are deemed inflationary enough and inflation stops falling next year.
Right, I see. Well, I suppose time will tell us for sure then. Professor Yang, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Andres, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for having us here.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for watching.